All right, welcome in class. It's so good to see you all. Take your seats. I was thinking, what color would you guys assign to your photo school notebook? You know how every subject you assign a color to? Like math was obviously green, science was blue, history was yellow, but what would photo school be? Because right now I'm leaning towards purple, but I would love to hear what you guys think. Okay? You're definitely going to be needing that notebook today because we are covering the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit of photography, which is ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. It really doesn't matter what kind of camera you have, whether it's a lower end camera or a higher end one. If you do not understand those three basic things, your photos aren't going to look the best. I mean, that's just the truth. I'm going to show you guys how each setting works, how they work together, and then how you can change them quickly under pressure. Okay, so ISO, which does that stand for anything? Is that an acronym? Hold on, let's look. Ooh, okay, so ISO is not actually an acronym, but rather a word derived from the Greek isos, meaning equal. Who gives a damn? I was going to say, if it was an acronym, I've never heard any other photographer say that. Everyone just says, what's your ISO set at? ISO, ISO. So anyways, ISO, what it is. This is essentially like the artificial light that your camera creates to counteract maybe the darkness that's happening in a setting. You can bump up your ISO, which starts at 100. You can bump it all the way up to, I think my camera is like 6400, which you do not want to do, but you can bump it up until you like the way your photo looks. So the one con is the higher the ISO is, the higher the amount of artificial light that you have to put on a photo, the grainier the image will look. So a lot of times you do not want to bump that ISO up too high because it will kind of ruin the image quality. So a lower ISO is always preferred. So remember, the higher the number, the brighter the image, the lower the number, the darker the image. Okay, now let me show you some examples of what a higher ISO and a lower ISO will do to an image. Okay, so next let's talk about aperture. Aperture is essentially like how blurry the background is behind you. So a lower number, which also is referred to as an f-stop number, the lower that f-stop number is, the more blurry the background will be and the more creamy your subject will look. So typically when you're looking at a lens, it will say that the lens is like 20 to 70 millimeters with an f-stop number of 2.8 or 1.2 or whatever that number is. That number is referring to the aperture, which is how blurry the background will be. The lower the number is, remember, the more blurry the background will be. Also, the lower the number is, the brighter your image will be, the more light it will be letting in. So a lower aperture, more blurry, also a brighter image. Let me put some examples in of what it would look like to have a higher aperture and a lower aperture. So a lot of times when I am shooting couples or weddings and things of that nature, I typically like to shoot in a lower aperture. So the camera that I'm using right now is a 1.2. I usually do 2.8 or lower at all times. I know sometimes when people are taking family photos, they'll like to bump it up to a 4 because, again, it makes your background blurry and the depth of field is a lot blurrier. So if you are shooting a large group and there's maybe some layers in different rows, sometimes if your aperture is too low, it won't think some of the people in the rows in the behind are subjects and it will make them blurry. So to ensure that you have a crisp photo where all of your subjects are in focus, good to have a higher aperture. Okay, now shutter speed. Shutter speed is exactly how it sounds. It's the speed at which your shutter is opening and closing. So if it is a lower number, that means that it is going to take your photo so much slower. And if it's a higher number, it's going to take your photo a lot faster. That's where you get the the sound. A lower shutter speed might kind of sound like ch, and then I hope this is helpful. And then a higher shutter speed is where you're going to get that quicker. So if you have a higher shutter speed, like a 1/500, 1/800, that is going to be a lot quicker than a 1/80, 1/100. Okay, now let me show you some examples of what a higher shutter speed would do versus a lower shutter speed. So times where you'd want to have a higher shutter speed is if you are taking a photo of someone that is moving. So if, for example, if you're photographing like a sporting event, someone dancing, if you're at a wedding, if there's anywhere where there's a lot of movement happening, you're going to want to make sure that your shutter speed is higher so it's able to capture all of the movement. Now, if you're taking like a product photo or a headshot or something where the subject is not moving, it's not as big a deal for you to have a higher shutter speed. Now, you still do not want it too low because even by nature, holding a camera, you might shake and move a little bit, and in turn, that will make your subject blurry. So sometimes when people are like, oh, my photos look blurry, I'm like, well, maybe your shutter speed is too low and it's not able to capture the image. So now with shutter speed, the higher the number, the darker the image, the lower the number, the lighter the image is. So you'll notice that all three of these, when you move them, affect light in some way. Now, let's talk about how all of these work together. Typically, when I am photographing something, I always set my aperture to the lowest setting. So remember, when you set your aperture to the lowest setting, it's going to make your image a little bit more bright. So let's say that I'm photographing outside and I'm photographing a couple. So since it's just two people, I'm going to set my aperture to the lowest possible. Let's pretend that I'm using a 50mm lens with like a 1.2 aperture, which means that that is the lowest the aperture can be. So I'm going to set my aperture to 1.2, which is a very, very low number for aperture. So since it's very low, the image probably is going to be pretty bright when I'm first looking at it when I'm outside. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my ISO, and I am going to make sure that my ISO is as low as possible. So let's say I put it at 100. I have my aperture at 1.2 and my ISO at 100, and the image is still super bright. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my shutter speed and I am going to make it higher, because the higher your shutter speed is, the darker your image. So I'm going to bump up my shutter speed until I feel like it looks exactly how I want it to look. Let's do a new situation. Let's say I'm at a sporting event and I want to make sure that my subject is very sharp. There's going to be a lot of movement, and so I need to have a high shutter speed. I'm going to first bump my shutter speed up to a high number, maybe like 1/800, 1/500, something that I feel is a good number that can capture all of the movement. Once I do that, I'm probably going to notice that the image is pretty dark. So I'm going to make sure that my aperture is the lowest it can be to brighten that up. And then I'm going to go over to my ISO. And because it is still so dark, I'm going to turn up my ISO to a high enough number until I can see and it looks good. So as you can see, all of these things work together. Now, let's give one other scenario. This happened to me at a wedding. So I'm outside and I know that I'm going to be having to capture the bride and groom walking down the aisle. So I set my shutter speed to a high enough, like a 300 to a 400, so I knew that I'd be able to capture the movement as they're walking down the aisle. And it was so bright out, so I then set my ISO to 100, and it was still just so bright. That is then when I would go over to my aperture and then bump that up until the photo looks like what it needs to do. So sometimes as you are balancing all of these things out, you might have to sacrifice something. I will always recommend having a higher ISO though, rather than dragging down your shutter speed, because you can always fix a grainy image, but you can't really fix it if it's blurry. So I always would want to make sure that my shutter speed is high enough that I'm not going to have to worry about my images getting blurry, and then fix everything else around that. Now, let's talk about how most times, especially if you're a wedding photographer, you're going to be going inside to outside, outside to inside constantly, which means that you're going to have to adjust your settings on the fly quickly. Typically for me, what I will do is when you are outside, your ISO is going to be lower and your shutter speed is going to be higher. And then when you go inside, you'll bump your shutter speed back down to a lower number, and your ISO will go up. So basically your shutter speed and ISO are probably going to be the two things that you toggle with the most in and out of your shoots. And then sometimes aperture. Again, I always like to keep my aperture at the lowest number unless I absolutely have to bump it up for lighting reasons, or if I'm taking a huge group photo and I'm worried about the depth of field, like blurring some of the people in the background. So that is just something to keep in mind. Okay, so let's just do a big overview of everything to make sure that we have it locked in. ISO is how much light is coming in and out of your camera. The higher the number, the brighter the image. The aperture is how blurry the background is. The lower the number, the more blurry and also the brighter the image. And then with shutter speed, it is how quickly your shutter will be opening and closing, capturing movement. So the higher the shutter speed, the better it is at capturing movement, the sharper your subjects will be. The lower that number, the more blurry it will be. Here's a little tip. If you've ever seen that photo where the bride and groom are in focus and everyone else around them is blurry, here is how you accomplish that with your camera. You are going to take your shutter speed and you are going to bring it to a very low number. And then what you're going to do is you're going to fix all of your other settings so that way the lighting looks good in camera. And then what happens is your bride and groom are going to stay in place so they aren't moving, so your camera can focus on them and then have a bunch of people walk around them. It will make everyone else blurry because remember, when there's movement, it makes everything blurry and your subject will be in focus because they're not moving. So that's how that works, okay? So when it comes to moments where you might be in high stress situations, when you're having to change your settings on a quick moment's notice, one thing that I do recommend is always giving up the ISO over the shutter speed. What I mean by that is I always recommend making a higher ISO rather than bringing your shutter speed down to make your image brighter, because you can always fix a grainy photo if you have to bump your ISO up, but it's so much harder to fix when your subjects are blurry because you had to bring your shutter speed down. So if you are in a pinch, always make sure to bump up the ISO if you need your photos to have more light. Now, if you are in a situation where you feel like you're really bumping that ISO up to a number that just doesn't feel right, that is where you probably should be using a flash. You use a flash in those settings where it is way too dark. The flash will expose and make more light so you can have your ISO down to like 100. And that's a whole nother episode, but that we can cover about flash. Oh, is that the bell? Oh my gosh. Okay, well, that is all for today's class. I hope you learned a lot, and I will see you next time.